Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have at the fact-finding mission on Iran just completed 2 years of our investigation into the human rights violations in the context of the protests that broke out in Iran in September 2022, following the unlawful death in custody of Jina Mahsa Amini. Last week we issued our report, and today we released further detailed findings in a conference room paper. We have now collected over 38,000 evidence items and conducted interviews with 287 victims and witnesses. We've also examined documents and materials produced by the government of Iran. This consolidated evidence strengthens our earlier findings that state authorities committed gross human rights violations, including unlawful killings, injuries, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, and a wide range of serious fair trial violations. Some of these violations amounted to crimes against humanity, including persecution on the grounds of gender. As we previously concluded, while some protesters did engage in isolated incidents of violence, in large part the protests were peaceful, and the authorities suppressed them with unnecessary, disproportionate, and unlawful use of force. This year, our investigations led us to reach further conclusions regarding the treatment of specific groups during the protests. We found that ethnic and religious minorities, in particular the Kurds and Baluchis, and LGBTQ+ persons were particularly targeted in the context of the protests. With respect to children, we found that even when protesting peacefully, many were killed and severely injured after being fired at with ammunition containing metal pellets. They were subjected to torture, including rape, and extremely violent treatment and detention, while denied access to their parents and lawyers. Many children, both boys and girls, were left with lifelong injuries, including blinding and lifelong trauma. Excellencies, I will focus my remaining remarks on 3 key takeaways from our findings. First, while the protests have subsided, repression continues and has been heightened both offline and online. Victims, survivors, and their families are being harassed, intimidated, and threatened for protected conduct, including for their efforts to seek justice and accountability, and even prevented still from mourning their loved ones. As we've heard, death sentences continue to be issued against those who took part in or supported protests. We reported earlier that 10 men had been executed in connection with the protests, and another 11 men and 3 women remain at imminent risk of execution. The new trend of death penalty against women is deeply worrying, especially in connection with the ongoing repression of women human rights defenders more generally. Over the last year, we've investigated dozens of cases of women and girls criminalized for their defiance of the mandatory hijab rules. While the hijab and chastity law does remain paused, aspects of it are already being enforced. The increased use of surveillance technology, including facial recognition and tracking apps, to monitor women's dress and conduct is particularly disturbing. We've found that women are still being fined, having their vehicles confiscated, and subjected to violent arrests and prison sentences, and even in some cases to state-sanctioned flogging. Just last week, 4 women human rights defenders were arrested in Kurdistan province after peacefully commemorating International Women's Day. We call for their full protection and the immediate release from detention of Leila Pashai, Sohela Motai, Soma Mohammad Razai, and Baran Saidi. Our second key takeaway is that national-level efforts to provide redress to victims and survivors remain glaringly inadequate. The victims and their families who've lodged complaints have faced further harassment, including by being criminalized themselves or subjected to threats and intimidation. We did receive and had contact with Iran's Special Committee on the 22 unrests, who informed us of 563 decisions being made in relation to judicial cases against law enforcement officials, and also informed us of compensation handed out to protesters. However, unfortunately, we received no verifiable details in this regard. Given the impunity that prevails inside Iran, we believe that accountability must be pursued also internationally, in line with the rights and expectations of victims and survivors with whom we've spoken. Our mission has now collected and analyzed material on the identities and responsibility of alleged perpetrators, and this is included in a confidential list which we will provide to the High Commissioner on Human Rights. We have also conducted a mapping of structures of state entities and created profiles of entities, incidents, and persons of interest, which will again be available for sharing with any credible legal proceedings. We've prepared a roadmap and recommendations for further action, including for establishing a proposed victims fund and for continuing to provide direct support to victims and survivors through humanitarian visas and medical and psychosocial support. Our third and final takeaway from these 2 years of investigations: we acknowledge that human rights concerns in Iran are vast and complex and far exceed the temporal and material scope of our mandate. Many of the serious violations and crimes that have been found have structural and systemic unaddressed root causes, including institutionalized discrimination and endemic impunity. These make their recurrence likely, if not probable. The enforcement of discriminatory laws and policies not only enables repression of women and girls, but also other groups on grounds of ethnicity, religion, and/or political belief. The suppression of these all equally warrant this Council's attention. For this reason, and in conclusion, we recommend that the Council consider a follow-up body. This could continue to investigate the serious human rights concerns already identified and also accompany accountability efforts. In this way, the Council can play a vital role in supporting Iranians' right to truth, justice, and reparations, and crucially, to prevent further cycles of violence. Thank you for your attention.